The late summer sun hung low over the Appalachian Mountains as we drove deeper into the winding roads that twisted like veins through the dense forest. I, along with my three friends, Mark, Claire, and Jason, were headed to an old cabin we'd rented for a long weekend getaway. It was Mark's idea, a chance to escape the noise of the city and experience something raw, unfiltered by the modern world. He'd found the listing online, a rustic cabin nestled somewhere in the backwoods of North Carolina's Smoky Mountains. The pictures were few and blurry, but the price was right, and the promise of solitude was too tempting to resist. The last stretch of the drive was rough. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then dirt, then barely a path marked by tire tracks barely visible through the overgrowth. Our old Jeep groaned as it crawled along, tires crunching over roots and stones. The trees were ancient here, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky. The forest pressed in close, and the daylight filtered weakly through the canopy. As we rounded the final bend, the cabin appeared in a small clearing. A squat log structure with a stone chimney, its roof sagging in places, windows grimy and shuttered. The air smelled of moss and damp earth, the silence heavy and almost tangible. No birds chirped, no wind stirred the leaves. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mark jumped out of the driver's seat, grinning. Home sweet home. Claire was uneasy. It looks abandoned. It is, Mark said. Just for the weekend, though. We're the only ones out here. Jason didn't say anything. He stared at the dark line of trees beyond the clearing, his jaw tight. Inside, the cabin smelled of old smoke and dust. The floorboards creaked beneath our boots, and the faded quilts on the beds looked like they hadn't been washed in years. There was no electricity, no running water, and the only source of light was the waning sunlight filtering through the windows. That first night, we gathered around a fire pit outside. The sky was clear, stars blazing above us like a scattering of fireflies. The forest was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the fire. We joked about the place being haunted, laughed off the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. When we went inside, the dark felt denser, thicker, like it was swallowing the walls whole. I lay awake listening to the cabin's creaks and groans, the sound of the wind pushing against the shutters. But then I heard something else, faint, deliberate footsteps on the floor above. Slow, pacing, heavy. Claire woke me, whispering that she heard it too. Mark said it was the old house settling, but I wasn't convinced. The footsteps kept pacing back and forth, sometimes stopping just above us, then moving again. The house felt alive with them, restless and watching. The next day, we set off on a hike through the dense woods. The trail was overgrown, barely visible, but the air was crisp and smelled of pine and earth. As we climbed higher, I noticed strange markings carved into tree trunks, spirals and sharp lines that didn't look natural. Jason pointed to some deep scratches on a rock face, way old and weathered. At one point, we caught glimpses of movement just beyond the trees, shadows slipping between trunks, watching. Back at the cabin, as the sun sank low, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew cold and damp. The fire refused to light properly, sputtering out no matter how much kindling we added. Then the whispering started. At first, it was just faint murmurs like wind rustling leaves, but it grew louder, a chorus of voices speaking in a language none of us recognized. The sound seeped through the walls, wrapping around us. Claire was visibly shaken, clutching her knees to her chest. Then came the scratching. Nails scraping the wood from outside, circling the cabin. The front door rattled as though something was trying to force its way in. Jason grabbed a lantern and ran outside, shouting into the thickening fog, but the forest swallowed his voice. Inside, the whispers grew to a deafening roar. The cabin vibrated with unseen energy. I felt hands brush against my skin, cold and clammy, though no one was there. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. We huddled together, too afraid to move. The fire reignited on its own, flames licking wildly as if fueled by a malevolent force. At dawn, silence returned. The cabin was cold and still. Outside, the strange carvings covered every tree in the clearing, their patterns glowing faintly in the morning light. We left immediately. Weeks later, the footsteps still echo in my dreams, and the whispering calls me back to those mountains, to that cabin in the heart of Appalachia, where the old spirits still watch, waiting. Story the end. The road leading into the Appalachian Mountains was narrow and twisting, bordered by dense forests whose shadows seemed to stretch longer as the sun began to dip below the horizon. I sat in the passenger seat beside my friend Mark, the only other person awake in the aging pickup truck as we drove further away from the nearest town. Behind us, Claire and Jason were quiet in the back, dozing off after the long drive. We were headed to a cabin deep in the heart of the mountains, a place Mark had rented for a weekend getaway. Something rustic, isolated, a break from the chaos of our everyday lives. The GPS stopped working miles ago, and the map Mark printed out was little more than a scribbled outline. The last stretch of the road was nothing more than a gravel path, riddled with potholes and barely wide enough for our truck. The trees leaned inward, creating a tunnel of dark green that swallowed the daylight faster than I expected. When we finally pulled into the clearing, the cabin was waiting for us in the dimming light. It was a squat, weather-beaten structure, built of rough logs that had darkened with age. The porch sagged in one corner, and the roof looked like it had survived more winters than anyone could count. There were no signs of modernity, no satellite dishes, no power lines, just the old woods and the cabin nestled between them. Mark hopped out, flashing a wide grin. This is it, pure mountain magic. Claire pulled herself from the back, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She looked skeptical but intrigued. Jason didn't move, his gaze fixed on the tree line, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Inside, the cabin was cold and smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. The floor creaked underfoot, and the windows rattled gently in the evening breeze. Dust settled thick on the shelves, and cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners. There was a stone fireplace that hadn't been used in ages, a kitchen with rusted utensils, and a small table scarred with years of use. We set down our bags and started unpacking. Mark tried lighting the old lanterns we'd brought, but the wicks were dry and brittle. No one mentioned the fact that there was no electricity, no cell service, no running water beyond the rusted pump outside. It was supposed to be part of the experience. That first night, the air grew cold quickly. The stars blinked out one by one behind heavy clouds, and the forest seemed to lean closer to the cabin. We gathered near the fireplace, struggling to coax a flame from the old wood. Then we heard it. Footsteps above us. Slow, heavy, deliberate steps pacing across the floorboards of the second story. Claire's breath caught, and she clutched my arm. Probably just an animal, Mark said, but his voice was less certain than usual. The footsteps circled above us for what felt like an eternity before fading away. The next day, we explored the trails winding through the woods. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of small creatures. But there were signs of something else. Broken branches, faint footprints in the mud that didn't match any of ours, strange symbols carved into tree trunks, ancient and unfamiliar. At dusk, the cabin felt different. The air was thick and still. The fire refused to stay lit, flickering out again and again. The whispering began. Faint voices speaking in an old guttural language we couldn't understand, rising and falling like the wind through the leaves. Jason went outside to investigate, but returned shaken, eyes wide with fear. He said he'd seen shadowy figures moving just beyond the tree line, watching us. That night, the scratching started, nails scraping the wood from outside, circling the cabin like something desperate to get in. The front door rattled violently, and cold air swept through the cracks, extinguishing what little light we had. We huddled together, listening to the house groan under the weight of unseen forces. The whispering voices swelled into a cacophony of anger and despair. Morning came with eerie calm. The forest was quiet, the sun casting weak light through the mist. Outside, strange markings covered every tree around the clearing, ancient symbols glowing faintly in the dawn. We packed quickly and left, the road back seeming longer, heavier, as if the mountains themselves were reluctant to let us go. Even now, months later, I can still hear the footsteps overhead and the whispering carried on the mountain winds. They call to me, a reminder that some places in Appalachia are older than time, and they never forget the ones who trespass. Story the end. The Appalachian Mountains are a place where stories live. Old tales whispered between the rustling leaves, and shadows that stretch longer than the sun ever should allow. When my friends and I decided to rent a cabin up there for a weekend getaway, we imagined nothing more than hiking trails, bonfires, and the kind of quiet city life had almost stolen from us. Daniel found the place. A rustic log cabin, apparently abandoned for years, tucked into a remote holler near the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. It was dirt cheap and came with a warning from the owner about being prepared for the isolation. The pictures online showed peeling paint, sagging porches, and an overgrown yard where wildflowers choked the pathway. It was perfect. Me, Daniel, his girlfriend Tessa, Jared, and his brother Chris packed up and left on a Friday morning. The drive grew narrower and rougher, and twisting up through winding roads that seemed to disappear behind thick stands of pine. By the time we reached the dirt track leading to the cabin, the GPS had given up entirely, replaced by an old paper map Daniel insisted on carrying. Our SUV rumbled over stones and ruts, dust billowing behind us in the late afternoon sun. The cabin emerged from the woods like a relic from another time. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees that blocked the fading light. The logs were cracked and dark, stained with decades of weather. The roof sagged in places, and the front porch's wooden boards creaked under the weight of time. Inside, dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of damp wood and something else, something faintly metallic, almost like blood, but too subtle to be sure. We settled in quickly, determined to make the most of the weekend. The first night was filled with the usual stories and laughter, the fire crackling in the hearth as we passed around bottles of beer and took turns trying to spook one another with local ghost tales. But even as the mood lightened, a chill clung to the cabin that didn't seem to come from the dropping temperature outside. As midnight deepened, the woods around us seemed to lean closer, swallowing the circle of firelight. I was the first to hear it, a soft scratching on the exterior walls. At first, I thought it was just tree branches scraping in the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic, deliberate. Then came a low murmur, almost like chanting, rising from the woods and melting into the breeze. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but the cadence was ancient, like a prayer or a curse whispered by the trees themselves. We tried to dismiss it as our imagination or the cabin settling. Chris, ever the skeptic, went outside to check. He didn't come back for a long time. When he finally did, his face was pale, and he refused to say what he saw. He just shook his head and sat silently by the fire, eyes darting into the darkness beyond. The next day, we went exploring the area, hoping to shake off the growing unease. The woods were beautiful but unnervingly still. We found strange symbols carved into tree trunks, circles crossed by lines, triangles enclosing spirals, and small bundles of sticks tied with twine, left like offerings or warnings. The trails we followed twisted back on themselves, leaving us disoriented and scrambling to find the cabin again as the sky began to darken. That night, the cabin seemed alive with unseen presence. Footsteps echoed upstairs, though no one dared to climb the stairs. The rocking chair in the corner began to move gently, creaking in the dim light. Doors slammed shut on their own, windows rattled despite the still air. We huddled together, whispering prayers and daring not to look into the corners where shadows thickened. Then came the voice, low and gravelly, a whisper that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. "Let me in." It wasn't human, not quite, but not entirely otherworldly either. It sounded desperate, angry, and old as the mountains. We didn't sleep that night. When morning came, the road was blocked by a fallen tree. We were trapped. Over the next hours, the cabin's oppressive atmosphere tightened like a noose. The chanting returned, louder and more insistent, filling every creak and whisper of the house. One by one, each of us saw figures, shadows that moved just beyond the edge of sight, faces twisted in silent screams, hands clawing at the walls. Chris vanished during the early morning hours. We searched but found only his flashlight abandoned near the edge of the woods, pointing towards the darkened forest. Panic gripped us. We barricaded the doors, but the knocking began, slow and heavy, echoing through the cabin like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. "Let me in," we screamed. We cried, but the walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing deeper into our souls. When daylight finally broke, the forest was silent and still again. The fallen tree was gone. We fled down the road without looking back. To this day, none of us have returned, but the cabin waits, hidden deep in the Appalachian holler, surrounded by shadows that never rest, whispering secrets in a language no one alive should understand. Story the end. The road was little more than a ragged track, twisting and turning through the dense Appalachian forest like a ribbon tangled in the undergrowth. I hadn't expected the drive to be so difficult. The map Jake had sent was vague at best, with no real markers except a faded name scribbled near the edge of the county. Old Mill Cabin, he'd called it, promising it was a great place to get away from the world. The promise of silence and solitude was exactly what I needed after months of city noise and sleepless nights. I eased my car along the dirt path, branches scraping the sides, leaves brushing the windshield, until finally the trees thinned and the cabin came into view. It sat in a small clearing, looking as though it might crumble under its own weight at any moment. Weathered logs formed the walls, blackened in places by age and smoke, and the sagging roof was patched with sheets of rusted tin. The porch was barely there, just a few rotted boards and a rickety railing leaning at a crooked angle. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, heavy with the scent of decay. Stepping out, I took a deep breath and felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. No cars, no hum of electricity, just the faint rustling of wind through the trees. I unlocked the door with the old key Jake had given me. The lock protested with a loud creak, but it gave way. Inside, the cabin was dim and cramped. A single room with a stone fireplace, an old cast-iron stove in one corner, and a threadbare mattress lying against the far wall. Dust coated every surface, and spider webs hung like curtains in the corners. The floor creaked beneath my feet, uneven and warped. I'd planned to stay for a week, bring some books, food, and just let the silence soak into me. I unpacked, lit a small fire in the stove, and settled in with a bottle of whiskey, letting the warmth chase away the chill that settled deep in the air. That first night, sleep was hard to come by. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind felt magnified in the stillness. Outside, the forest seemed to press in close, shadows stretching long and strange. Around midnight, I woke to a soft tapping sound at the window, like nails lightly rapping against the glass. I froze, staring into the darkness beyond. Nothing moved. The next morning, I told myself it was just a branch or a bird. The woods were alive, after all. But as I moved about, I noticed strange things. The firewood I'd stacked was scattered as if disturbed, footprints in the soft earth around the cabin that weren't mine or any animal I recognized. They were large, uneven, and deep, pressing into the soil as though something heavy had walked by. That afternoon, I ventured out to explore, hoping fresh air would calm my nerves. The trail I followed led me deeper into the forest, the canopy so thick that only dappled light touched the ground. I found old stone foundations half swallowed by moss, remnants of cabins and sheds long abandoned. The silence here was heavier than before, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant snap of a twig. As I turned to head back, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure slipping between the trees, pale and indistinct. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart pounded, and I quickened my pace back to the cabin. That night, the noises returned. This time, a scraping sound circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, like claws dragging against wood. I held the flashlight tight, the beam trembling as I swept it across the porch and yard. In the beam, I thought I saw eyes, reflecting red and cold, watching me from the shadows. But when I focused, nothing was there. Sleep was impossible. I sat by the fire, trying to keep the dread at bay. Then, from the loft above, I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, pacing back and forth. The cabin groaned and creaked under the weight of the unseen presence. I climbed the stairs cautiously, the wooden steps groaning with each careful step. The loft was empty, save for broken floorboards and a thin layer of dust disturbed by what looked like scratch marks across the planks. The air was colder up there, and a faint metallic smell hung in the stillness. I fled back downstairs, slamming the door behind me, but the feeling lingered, like eyes watching from the dark corners. Waiting. On the third night, the door shook violently, as if someone or something were trying to force it open. I grabbed my phone to call Jake, but there was no signal. The cabin was cut off from the world. The pounding grew louder, desperate, and then stopped suddenly. Silence settled like a heavy blanket. Then a whisper, soft, unintelligible, coming from just outside the window. I didn't sleep again. At dawn, I packed what I could and made a run for the car. As I drove away, I glanced back once. The cabin sat in the clearing, still and silent. But in the window, I thought I saw a pale face staring back at me, eyes empty and endless. I never returned. Story the end. That cabin wasn't on any tourist map or rental site. It wasn't something you stumbled upon by accident. You had to hear about it from someone who'd been there, or maybe from someone who'd come close. It was the kind of place locals talked about in hushed voices, warning outsiders not to go near, especially after dark. The stories were vague but unsettling. Strange lights in the woods, sudden disappearances, and eerie sounds that no one could explain. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but when my friend Matt brought it up one night after a few beers, something about his tone made me listen more carefully. Matt had grown up near the Appalachians, and his family knew the area better than anyone. He said the cabin sat deep in the hills of West Virginia, tucked between ridges that locals called the Devil's Backbone. The last time someone rented it, they'd left a note in the guest book saying they never wanted to return. Matt was curious and a little reckless. When he suggested we take a weekend trip out there, I hesitated, but agreed. I thought it would be a fun getaway, a chance to escape the city and maybe scare ourselves a little with the legends. We planned it for the second weekend in October when the leaves were turning and the air smelled crisp. The drive was longer than I expected, twisting mountain roads with hardly any traffic and patches where cell service dropped to nothing. We packed enough food and supplies to last, plus a bunch of flashlights and a portable generator Matt had insisted on bringing, just in case. We needed all the light we could get. When we finally reached the gravel driveway, the cabin came into view. It was small and weathered, built from dark logs that looked like they'd been there for 100 years. The roof sagged a little and the porch creaked underfoot. No neighbors anywhere, just thick woods all around, stretching up the hills and disappearing into the shadows. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with damp wood and something faintly metallic. The furniture was old and worn, but it looked like someone had cared for it once. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a few bedrooms upstairs. The floors creaked, and the walls groaned when the wind picked up outside. We unpacked quickly, trying to shake the chill that settled over us. That first night was mostly quiet, but nothing like the peaceful silence I was expecting. The woods outside were alive with sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, distant calls that didn't sound like any animal I knew. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. We chalked it up to nerves and the way the moonlight played tricks. Around midnight, Matt and I went outside to check the generator. The night was colder than I anticipated, the air thick with mist that curled around the tree trunks like fingers. We heard the whistle then, a low, mournful sound, not like anything natural. It started far away, then slowly moved closer, drifting between the trees in a way that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Matt stopped dead in his tracks. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the whistle stopped, replaced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, circling the cabin. We shined our flashlights into the darkness, but nothing was there. The noise faded, and a cold wind blew out the generator, plunging us into blackness. We scrambled back inside and locked every door and window. The rest of the night was a restless blur of shadows and silence. The next day, we tried to keep busy hiking the trails, but the forest seemed oppressive, watching. Every crack of a branch felt too loud. At dusk, as we gathered firewood, the air went still. The birds stopped singing, the wind died. That same eerie silence stretched out, broken only by the faintest whisper, like someone breathing right behind us. When night fell, the cabin felt different. The shadows inside seemed deeper, almost alive. Our flashlights flickered. The fire in the hearth died without warning. Then came the knocking, 3 slow, deliberate hits on the front door. We froze. No one was outside, no footprints in the dirt, just the knocking. It came again, louder this time, then stopped. We didn't sleep that night. The whispers returned, voices calling our names, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry. I caught glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows darting just beyond the light. By the 3rd day, panic was setting in. We packed in silence, eager to leave, but the cabin seemed to resist. The door wouldn't open. The windows were fogged over, the voices grew louder, more insistent. Then, just as dawn broke, everything stopped. The doors opened easily, the windows cleared. We ran down the mountain road, not daring to look back until we reached the highway. I haven't been back since. I don't know what haunted that cabin in the Appalachians, but I know some places don't want visitors. And sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees on a quiet night, I still hear that whistle, low and mournful, reminding me that the forest is watching. Story: The End. That night, the air was thick with the smell of rain-soaked pine needles and wet earth. I pulled the rental truck to a stop on the narrow gravel road, the headlights casting long, distorted shadows from the towering Appalachian trees. The GPS had lost signal miles back, but I knew I was close. The cabin was supposed to be tucked deep in these woods, far from any real sign of civilization. I had found the listing online almost by accident. A rustic, off-the-grid cabin available for weekend rentals in a remote part of the Smoky Mountains. I wanted to get away from the noise and people for a few days, maybe do some writing and hiking. The pictures looked inviting enough. A small log cabin with a stone chimney, a wood porch surrounded by forest, peaceful and quiet. But now, standing outside the truck, I felt a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The road was a narrow trail, barely wide enough for the truck. Thick trees crowded the edges, their trunks slick with moss. The only sound was the soft patter of rain and the occasional drip from the leaves overhead. The sky was gray and heavy, threatening more rain. I grabbed my bag and flashlight and made my way down the last stretch to the cabin. It was small and squat, built of heavy logs that had darkened with age and weather. The porch sagged under years of neglect, and the windows were clouded with dirt and grime. It looked more abandoned than welcoming. I pushed open the door, which creaked loudly on rusty hinges. Inside, the cabin smelled of mildew and old wood. The air was damp and musty, the kind of smell that lingers in places left untouched for too long. There was a wood stove in one corner, a few chairs, and a small table covered with a thick layer of dust. I flipped on the flashlight and set my bag down, trying to shake the feeling of unease creeping over me. The place was darker and colder than I expected. As I moved through the cabin, I noticed scratches in the wooden floor near the doorway, deep and uneven, as if something large had clawed at the wood. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just old damage. I stoked the fire in the stove and tried to warm the place up. Night fell quickly in these mountains, and soon I was alone in the dim glow of the fire, the rain tapping against the roof like a slow drumbeat. I settled into a chair, trying to lose myself in a book, but the silence was oppressive. Then, from somewhere outside, I heard a soft, low moaning, barely audible at first, like the wind sighing through the trees. But it grew louder, more distinct, until it sounded like a human voice calling out in pain. I froze, straining to listen. The moan turned into a whispering chant, words I couldn't understand, but felt like they were meant to reach me. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch, shining the beam into the dark forest. Nothing. Just the thick woods, wet and shadowed. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by the snap of a branch breaking nearby. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Back inside, I locked the door and bolted it as best I could, though the old wooden lock barely held. I sat by the fire, clutching a heavy poker, listening as the rain grew heavier and the night deepened. Hours passed, and the forest seemed to close in tighter around the cabin. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin's perimeter. They were too heavy for an animal, too measured for the wind. I peered out a window and caught a glimpse of a dark figure moving between the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. It stopped when it saw me, and for a moment I thought it might be a person, a lost hiker or a neighbor. But the figure was too still, too unnatural. Then the figure vanished into the shadows. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and restless watching. When morning finally came, the rain had stopped and the forest was quiet once again. I packed my things quickly, eager to leave, but as I stepped outside, I noticed footprints circling the cabin. Large, heavy prints, not human, but unmistakably present. I never went back. Story: The End. The first time I ever heard of the cabins tucked away deep in the Appalachian foothills, it was from an old coworker of mine named Aaron. He had grown up in Kentucky, not far from the border of West Virginia, and he swore up and down that the hollers and ridges out there weren't just quiet. They were alive in ways people didn't want to understand. I didn't take him seriously back then. We were in our 20s, working construction, and he always had some wild backwoods tale that he told to keep us entertained while we shoveled gravel or hauled lumber. But years later, I found myself face to face with the kind of silence he'd warned me about, and I realized how little I'd listened. It started with a trip that wasn't even meant to be scary. My girlfriend at the time, Megan, suggested a long weekend away from the city. She'd found a cabin rental listed online, cheap enough that I was suspicious. The photos showed a rough-hewn wooden cabin with a tin roof sitting right against a tree line. The listing said it was in eastern Tennessee, close to the border of North Carolina, and advertised true mountain seclusion. That was the appeal for her: privacy, nature, no cars buzzing by, no neighbors yelling through apartment walls. The drive took us longer than we expected. Once we got off the main highway, the GPS started failing. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then gravel gave way to rutted dirt paths that twisted up and down the slopes like veins. The trees grew denser, shadows pressing against the windshield. The further we went, the more I realized how easy it would be to get lost if we didn't pay close attention. There weren't any landmarks, just endless forest and the occasional rusted-out truck sitting half-sunk in weeds. I thought about Aaron's stories then, the way he described cabins folks shouldn't rent, but do anyway. When we finally found the place, evening light was already sliding behind the ridges. The cabin looked smaller than the pictures had made it seem. It had a porch with a rocking chair that looked like it hadn't rocked in years, its slats green with mildew. The forest crowded right up to the clearing, like the trees were pressing in, but had stopped short of touching the cabin itself. There was no driveway, just a flattened patch of dirt where we parked. Inside, the air smelled musty. Dust motes spun in the beams of light coming through the single-pane windows. It was simple: one bedroom, a little living space with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen with outdated appliances. But it wasn't the rustic charm Megan had expected. There was something about the way it sat, stale, heavy, as if no one had stayed there in years. On the mantel above the fireplace, I noticed an old clock that had stopped at 3:12. The second hand was frozen mid-tick, and no matter how many times I tapped the glass, it wouldn't budge. That first night, it was quiet, too quiet. Out in the woods, you expect insects, frogs, owls, some kind of nighttime chorus. But as the sun dropped and the woods fell dark, it was like a switch had been thrown. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin as it settled. Megan tried to shrug it off, curling up on the old sofa with a book, but I kept pacing, looking out the windows. Every time I stared into the tree line, I felt like the shadows shifted, like something darker than the dark was standing between the trees. Around midnight, just as Megan had fallen asleep, I heard it. A scrape, faint but sharp, across the wooden porch. My heart jumped. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal: raccoon, possum, even a stray dog. But when I leaned closer to the window, I saw nothing. The rocking chair, though, had moved. Not much, just slightly angled from where it had been. I told myself the wind had nudged it, but the air outside was still. Not a leaf stirred. The following day, we tried to shake off the unease. We hiked a little, following a deer trail into the hills, but it didn't take long for us to feel turned around. Every ridge looked the same, every hollow identical. Megan laughed nervously about deliverance vibes, but I kept glancing behind us, sure I'd heard footsteps shadowing ours. By the time we got back to the cabin, the sun was dipping again, and I felt that same suffocating quiet slide over the woods. That night, the noises escalated. At first, the sound of boots on the porch, not shuffling like an animal, but deliberate steps. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to listen. Megan whispered, "Do you hear that?" before I could even ask. We didn't move, barely breathing. Then the sound stopped. Seconds dragged on, and just when I thought maybe it was over, something heavy thumped against the wall of the bedroom, like a fist or shoulder slam. Megan yelped and clutched my arm. I wanted to run outside to shine my flashlight, but something deep in me knew better. By morning, there were marks on the porch. Faint, but there. Muddy footprints. Not boots, not bare feet. Something in between. Wide, uneven, with long toes that dragged in the dirt. Megan wanted to leave, pack up, and find a motel in town, but I stubbornly said we'd already paid and that it was probably some weird prank by locals. I didn't believe that myself, but saying it out loud felt like armor. The third night broke me. The footsteps came earlier, just after dusk. The rocking chair groaned back and forth like someone was sitting in it. I stood at the window, flashlight trembling in my hand, and when I finally dared to flick it on, the beam caught movement, a figure slipping back into the trees. It wasn't clear, not fully. Just a pale outline, lanky, too tall, shoulders hunched unnaturally. The light barely kissed it before it was gone, but the image burned into me. Megan was crying, begging me to pack up. But before we could, something else started. Knocking, not on the front door, but the windows. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, measured. First one window, then another, circling the cabin. We pulled the curtains tight, but the sound continued, circling, circling. The old clock on the mantel began ticking again, loud and frantic, though I knew it had been dead. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was clutch Megan and wait for it to stop. At some point, I must have blacked out from exhaustion or fear, because I woke at dawn on the couch, Megan asleep against my chest. The cabin was still. The clock was frozen again at 3:12. On the inside of the glass door leading to the porch, smeared in condensation, was a handprint. Too long, fingers stretching far beyond what a normal hand could leave. We didn't stay another night. We didn't even cook breakfast. We threw our bags in the car and left, bouncing down those rutted dirt roads, desperate for the highway. But the strangest part wasn't behind us. It followed. For weeks afterward, Megan swore she heard tapping on her apartment windows, even though she lived on the third floor. I woke more than once at exactly 3:12 a.m., heart hammering, sure I could hear the creak of a rocking chair somewhere close. Years later, I told Aaron about it, the guy who used to spin tales on the job. He just looked at me, real quiet, and finally said, "You stayed in one of those cabins. I told you some of them don't belong to people anymore. They belong to what's in the hills." I wanted to believe he was exaggerating, the way he always had. But deep down, I knew he wasn't. Because even now, when I close my eyes and listen hard, I can still hear the scrape of wood against wood, like a chair moving by itself, waiting for me to come back and see who's sitting in it. Story the end. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the mountains when we finally turned off the main highway onto the narrow, winding dirt road. The trees pressed close on either side, their dense branches casting long shadows that seemed to swallow the path whole. My friend Ben was behind the wheel, carefully navigating the ruts and rocks as we climbed deeper into the heart of the Appalachians. Beside me sat Lisa, and in the back were Tyler and Megan. All of us packed tight in Ben's aging pickup, bags stuffed into every available space. We were heading to a cabin Ben's uncle had told him about, an old family place he barely remembered, left abandoned for years, but supposedly still standing strong deep in the woods near Asheville. The plan was simple: 4 days away from cell service and city noise, a chance to escape and breathe fresh mountain air. None of us really expected what was waiting. The road grew rougher the farther we went, fading from dirt to gravel and then just a narrow trail carved out between thick pines and oaks. The air was cooler here, heavy with the scent of damp leaves and pine sap. As the last rays of sunlight slipped away, the forest came alive with the calls of night birds and the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. When we pulled into the clearing, the cabin was a shadowed silhouette against the darkening sky. It was smaller than I imagined, a simple log structure with a porch sagging under the weight of years and weather. The windows were clouded with grime, and the front door hung slightly ajar. It looked like something from a ghost story, abandoned, forgotten, and a little bit hungry. We jumped out, stretching cramped limbs, and unloaded what supplies we could carry inside. The cabin smelled of old wood, mold, and something faintly metallic, a scent that made my stomach tighten. There was no electricity, no running water, just the empty silence of a place left to the wild. We set about lighting a fire in the stone hearth, the flickering flames chasing away some of the cold and shadows. Around the fire, we shared stories and laughed to keep the nerves at bay, but there was a tension beneath it all, the kind of feeling that something watched from the edges of the woods, waiting. That first night, the forest's silence was broken by scratching at the walls. At first, it was faint, easy to dismiss as branches brushing the cabin or rodents in the attic. But the noises grew louder, more deliberate. Heavy thuds on the porch, slow footsteps pacing around the house. Whispers floated on the breeze, unintelligible, urgent, and cold. We took turns watching the windows, flashlights sweeping the dark woods, but there was never anything visible. Just the weight of something unseen pressing close. The air felt thick, electric, like the forest itself was alive and displeased. At one point, I swore I heard a low growl just beyond the tree line, but when I shined my light, nothing stirred except the swaying branches. Megan clutched a kitchen knife, eyes wide, refusing to be left alone. The nights blurred together, filled with unsettling sounds, fleeting shadows, and the creeping sense that the cabin was no longer just a shelter, but a trap. One morning, we found strange symbols carved into the porch railing, jagged lines and circles that hadn't been there the day before. None of us could explain them. By the last night, the knocking came. Slow, deliberate raps at the door, 3 in a row, then a pause, then 3 more. The sounds circled the cabin, moving from front to back, like someone walking carefully around the building in the dark. We didn't answer. We didn't sleep. When dawn finally came, we packed up and left without looking back, the forest swallowing the cabin behind us like it never existed. Even now, months later, I sometimes hear those knocks in the silence of my apartment. And when the wind rustles just right, I swear I hear the whispers again, carried on the Appalachian breeze. Story. The end. The gravel road twisted deeper into the mountains as the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting the forest in long, trembling shadows. I'd been driving for hours, the heavy weight of the week's stress pressing down on me, until finally I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat. It was an old place, weathered and worn, built from rough-hewn logs darkened by years of rain and neglect. The porch sagged under the weight of time, and the windows were dusty, reflecting the last golden light like dull, cloudy eyes. I pulled my truck up alongside the rutted driveway and cut the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming. No hum of traffic, no ringing cell phones, only the whisper of the wind through the trees and the faint chirp of crickets settling in for the night. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots, and took a slow breath. This cabin was supposed to be my refuge for the weekend, a break from the city, from everything. My plan was simple: get out of the house, unplug, and find some peace. I hadn't told many people I was coming. The owner, an elderly man named Carter, had been vague but welcoming on the phone. He said the cabin was mine to use as long as I respected the place and stayed safe. Safe. The word felt heavy here. The front door protested with a creak as I pushed it open, revealing a dim interior where dust motes floated in the fading light. The cabin smelled of old wood, mothballs, and something faintly metallic. I flicked on the lantern Carter had left on the table. The yellow glow flickered across peeling wallpaper and cracked floorboards. I dropped my bag by the door and stretched out my legs. The furniture was sparse: a battered rocking chair by the fireplace, a small table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the back room. The place was simple but sturdy, just enough to keep out the cold. I started a fire in the stone hearth. The logs caught quickly, filling the room with warm light and crackling sounds that felt like company. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a shiver through the cabin. As night fell, the shadows outside deepened, stretching fingers across the porch. I sat by the fire, reading an old paperback Carter had left on the table, an Appalachian folktale about spirits that roamed the mountains. The story was creepy, but felt far away, like a campfire tale told to scare kids. Around midnight, the fire had burned low, and I was about to call it a night when I heard it. A slow, deliberate knocking at the front door. My heart jumped. I wasn't expecting anyone. The road was too rough for casual visitors, and no cell signal meant no quick calls for help. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the window. The porch was empty. The knocking came again, faint but steady. I told myself it was just a tree branch tapping against the wood in the wind. But then I heard footsteps, soft, dragging, moving around the cabin's perimeter outside. I locked the door and moved to the back window, shining the flashlight into the woods. The beam caught nothing but swaying branches. I sat back down, trying to steady my breathing, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. The knocking started again, this time from the back door. I got up, heart pounding, and shone the light toward the door. The porch was empty. I stepped outside, the cool night air sharp against my skin. The forest was silent, save for the rustling leaves. Then I saw them. Footprints in the soft dirt, bare and small, circling the cabin. They didn't belong to any animal I knew. I swallowed hard and stepped back inside, locking the door once more. The night stretched on, filled with whispered voices just beyond hearing, shadows that flickered at the edge of the lantern's glow, and the unshakable certainty that something was out there, waiting. When dawn finally broke, I didn't wait. I packed up and left, the forest's silent eyes burning into my back as I drove away. I never went back. Story the end. The sun was setting behind the Appalachian ridges when we finally found the turnoff. The GPS had long since lost signal, leaving us to rely on Casey's rusty old truck and the fading memory of a map he swore he'd studied. It was just the four of us. Me, Casey, his younger brother Ben, and my girlfriend Sarah. We'd been looking forward to this trip for months, an escape from the grind of daily life. Casey's uncle owned a cabin somewhere deep in the woods, a place untouched by cell towers or city noise. The gravel road narrowed quickly, twisting sharply and disappearing under a canopy of tall oaks and pines. The air smelled cooler here, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. We joked and laughed to keep spirits up, but there was a nervous edge in the back of my mind as the trees seemed to crowd closer, swallowing the light. When the cabin came into view, it looked smaller than I expected, more worn. Weather-beaten logs, darkened by years of rain, the roof sagging in spots, and a porch that seemed barely able to hold its own weight. The windows were dirty and the curtains hung like shadows inside. Still, Casey swore it was perfect, and as we unloaded the truck, the weight of the mountains settled around us. Inside, the smell of old wood and smoke lingered. There was no electricity, only a few oil lamps and a wood stove. The furniture was sparse, a rickety table, some folding chairs and beds with thin mattresses. It was quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. This was the kind that pressed against your skin. We ate dinner by lantern light, the forest outside black and silent except for the occasional rustle. After, we gathered around the fire, telling stories to pass the time. But as the night deepened, a strange feeling crept over me, like eyes were watching from just beyond the firelight. Later, as I lay in bed, I heard it, a soft tapping on the window nearest my head. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate. I froze, heart pounding, and strained to see outside, but there was only darkness and the sway of branches. I told myself it was nothing, probably a branch in the wind. But the tapping came again and again every night. On the second day, Ben found scratches on the doorframe, deep, ragged marks that hadn't been there before. None of us could explain them. We tried to ignore the signs, but the woods grew stranger. No birds sang, no animals stirred. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. On the third night, the tapping turned into pounding. Fists or claws beat against the cabin walls, the door shaking violently. A voice whispered through the cracks, low and ragged, "Let me in." We barricaded the door and huddled together, terrified. By dawn, the door was splintered, the windows shattered, and the claw marks fresh and deep. We left without looking back, the forest seeming to watch us as we drove away. Even now, sometimes I hear those 3 slow knocks, waiting. Story the end. The Appalachian Mountains have always carried an aura of mystery, a stretch of rolling green hills that fold into misty valleys where old stories linger like fog. I had heard a handful of them before, about strange lights on the ridges, disembodied voices that carried on the wind, and cabins deep in the woods where no one dared to stay the night. But it wasn't until a trip with a few friends in the fall of 2016 that I understood those weren't just old mountain tales. They were warnings. It was my friend Marcus who suggested the trip. He had inherited a small patch of land from his grandfather, tucked away near the border of North Carolina and Tennessee. On it sat an old cabin, weather-worn, leaning a little, and surrounded by endless forest. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, and the last time anyone had stayed in it was probably decades earlier. Marcus figured it would be the perfect place for a real weekend away, far from the noise of the city. He said we could bring some food, a few lanterns, maybe a generator if we wanted, and just experience the mountains as they were meant to be experienced. There were 4 of us who went: Marcus, his girlfriend Heather, our buddy Cole, and me. We drove up on a Friday afternoon in Marcus's old Jeep, the kind of vehicle that could rattle itself to pieces but never seem to die. By the time we left the main road, the sun was already dipping, casting the hills in long shadows. The dirt road we followed snaked deeper into the woods, the canopy above so thick in some places that it felt like dusk even before the sun had set. I noticed how quiet it was out there. Not just the kind of quiet you get when you leave the city, but something heavier, pressing in. Every now and then we'd pass an old house or a mailbox leaning to one side, but mostly it was just trees and more trees. Marcus kept pointing things out. The creek where he used to fish as a kid, the trail his grandfather swore was made by deer but looked suspiciously like old wagon ruts. But all I could think about was how remote this place was. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly like what I had pictured. The logs were dark with age, moss growing thick in the spaces between them. The roof sagged a little, and one of the shutters hung crooked, banging lightly in the breeze. The clearing around it wasn't much bigger than the cabin itself, and the trees pressed close as if waiting for the place to fall in on itself so they could reclaim it. Marcus was grinning like he had brought us to some hidden paradise, but Heather didn't look impressed. "It looks haunted," she said, half joking but half serious. Cole laughed and clapped his hands together. "Perfect. That's the vibe we're going for, right?" We unloaded the Jeep and got ourselves settled. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The floor creaked under our weight, and cobwebs hung thick in the corners. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, an old rocking chair by the window, and a small wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs. The place looked abandoned, but not untouched. A thin layer of dust coated most surfaces. Yet I noticed faint scuff marks on the floor near the door, as if someone had come through not too long ago. We lit a couple of lanterns, unpacked our sleeping bags, and got a fire going in the fireplace. The crackle of the flames and the soft light made the cabin feel almost cozy, like we had stepped back into some older, simpler time. Marcus told stories about his grandfather living there when he was younger, how he used to hunt these woods and talk about the land as if it had a personality of its own. When night fell, the forest outside became a wall of black. I stepped out onto the porch for some air, and I couldn't see 5 feet past the trees. The chirping of insects was loud at first, but after a while it faded until only the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves broke the silence. I remember thinking it was odd. Back home, the woods were always alive at night. Out here, it felt like the forest was holding its breath. That first night was when I heard it. We'd all been sitting around the fire inside, drinking a little, talking, when the sound drifted in through the cracks in the cabin's walls. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, faint but unmistakable. A whistle. It wasn't a bird call. It wasn't random. It was the kind of whistle someone makes when they're trying to get attention. 3 slow notes, rising and falling, carried through the trees. We all went quiet. "You hear that?" Cole asked, leaning forward. "Probably just some hunter," Marcus said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. "At night?" Heather muttered. We waited, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually, we tried to laugh it off. Just the woods, we told ourselves. Just the strange noises a forest makes. But I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my stomach. That night, as we lay in our sleeping bags, I kept waking up. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the fire as it burned low made my heart beat faster. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps outside on the porch, slow, deliberate creaks of wood under weight. I held my breath, waiting for someone to knock or open the door, but the sound just stopped after a minute. I didn't dare get up to check. In the morning, I told myself I had imagined it. The next day, we decided to hike deeper into the woods. Marcus wanted to show us an old foundation his grandfather had told him about, the remains of some long-abandoned homestead. The trail was overgrown, barely more than a deer path, but Marcus seemed to know where he was going. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest felt. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangling above us, and the air grew still, heavy. When we reached the foundation, it wasn't much, just a few crumbling stones in a rectangle, moss and vines covering most of it. But standing there, I felt a chill. It was the kind of place that didn't want visitors. Heather refused to step inside the outline of the stones. She said it felt wrong. Cole teased her, but I noticed he didn't step inside either. On the way back, we found something none of us could explain. Hanging from a tree branch at eye level was a bundle of sticks tied together with twine. It wasn't random. 3 sticks lashed into a shape almost like a figure, dangling there in the breeze. Marcus frowned and pulled it down, muttering something about kids playing around, but there was no sign anyone had been out there. By the time we got back to the cabin, the sun was sinking, and a heavy fog was rolling in through the trees. The forest disappeared into a gray wall, and even the clearing seemed to shrink. That night, the whistling came back. Louder this time, closer, the same 3 notes, over and over. We sat frozen around the fire, lantern light flickering on our faces. "That's not an animal," Cole said quietly. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and stormed out onto the porch, shining it into the fog. "Hey, who's out there?" he shouted. His voice sounded small in the stillness. No answer came. The whistle stopped, but I swear I heard something moving just beyond the edge of the light. When Marcus came back in, he locked the door and slid the bolt shut. None of us slept well that night. Every so often I thought I heard the whistle again, faint and distant, like it was circling us. On the 3rd day, things got worse. Heather woke up with scratches on her arm, 3 thin lines like claw marks. She swore she hadn't done it herself, and the way they were angled, it was hard to imagine how she could have. We tried to calm her down, saying maybe she scraped herself on something in her sleep, but I saw the fear in her eyes. Later, when we went to fetch water from the creek, we found more of those stick figures, dozens of them hanging from trees, scattered all along the path. Some were bigger than the first, almost human-sized. They swayed silently in the fog, and for the first time, Marcus looked rattled. He muttered something about packing up and leaving the next morning. That night, none of us could bring ourselves to sleep. We sat in the cabin with the fire burning high, listening. Around midnight, the whistling started again. This time, it wasn't just one whistle. There were 2. One close, one farther away, answering each other. Cole grabbed the hatchet we had used for firewood and stood by the door. Heather was crying softly. Marcus just stared into the flames, jaw tight. The sound of footsteps came next. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Every few minutes, something brushed against the walls, the sack or the porch creaked. Once, I swore I saw a shadow move past the window, just barely outside the glow of the lantern. None of us spoke. None of us moved. The sounds lasted for hours until finally, just before dawn, they stopped. When the sun rose, we stepped outside, exhausted and shaky. All around the cabin, hanging from the trees, were more stick figures, hundreds of them, tangled in branches, swaying in the morning light. We didn't pack carefully. We just threw our things into the Jeep and left. The whole drive back down the mountain, no one said a word. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. I don't know what the whistles meant, or who hung those figures in the trees. All I know is that something didn't want us there. Something old, something patient, something that had watched the cabin for a long, long time. I've never been back to those mountains since, and I never will. Story the end. The winding road up the mountain was narrow and rough, barely wide enough for one vehicle, flanked on both sides by towering trees that blotted out the late afternoon sun. I sat in the back seat of the old pickup truck, my eyes fixed on the dense green walls of the Appalachian forest rushing past. My friends, Josh and Emily, were up front, chatting excitedly about the weekend ahead, but I could only think about the stories I'd heard, the warnings whispered by locals about the woods around this cabin, the ones no one dared to spend the night in. Josh's family had owned the cabin for years, tucked deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, a place unreachable except by a long, rutted dirt trail. The cabin itself was as old as the hills, logs blackened by smoke, windows covered in grime, the roof sagging under moss, and years of neglect. Josh said it hadn't been used in months, maybe longer, and that was exactly why we wanted to go. No electricity, no cell signal, just the forest and the cabin. We arrived just before dusk. The first thing that struck me was the silence. No birds, no insects. Nothing except the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by trees so tall and close they seemed to be watching us. We pulled our bags from the truck bed and hurried inside as the sun slipped behind the mountain. The air inside smelled of old wood and damp earth, with the faintest trace of something else, something metallic, almost like blood. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet. We lit a fire in the stone hearth and unpacked our supplies. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms and a main room with a battered table and a few rickety chairs. The only light came from the fire and a single kerosene lamp Josh had brought. That night, after we'd eaten, the woods outside grew darker and colder. I sat near the fire, staring into the flames when I first heard it, a slow, deliberate whistle, 3 notes rising and falling in the night air. It was faint but unmistakable. Josh told me to ignore it, that it was probably just some local hunter or a hiker trying to find their way. But the whistle didn't stop. It circled the cabin, coming closer and then fading into the distance. Emily was the first to admit she felt uneasy. She kept glancing toward the windows, whispering that the shadows outside seemed to move on their own. When the whistle returned, this time accompanied by soft footsteps crunching on the dry leaves, we all fell silent. The noises circled the cabin for hours, like something or someone was stalking us, toying with us. At one point, the kerosene lamp flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness except for the dying firelight. We huddled together, too afraid to even whisper. Around midnight, there was a sudden knock on the door. 3 slow, heavy raps. Josh grabbed the hunting rifle we'd brought and cautiously opened the door. No one was there, but hanging from a tree branch just outside was a crude figure made from twigs and scraps of cloth, tied together like a grotesque doll. We didn't speak of it, but the fear was there, thick and tangible. The next day, we tried to keep busy, hiking along the narrow trail to a nearby creek. The forest was eerily silent again, and the stick figures appeared everywhere, dangling from branches propped against rocks arranged in small piles. Josh looked increasingly tense, muttering about old mountain superstitions and curses. That night, the whistling started again, louder and more insistent, joined by a soft tapping on the windows and footsteps circling the cabin. At one point, we saw a shadowy figure standing just beyond the wire light, watching us with empty eyes. We left at first light, the truck rumbling down the mountain as the forest seemed to close behind us, swallowing the cabin and its dark secrets once more. I still hear that whistle sometimes, carried on the wind late at night, and I know those woods aren't done with me. Story: the end.